We are starting a brand new series called Little Foxes today, as we just saw in the video. The title of this series is actually out of an ancient book of Hebrew poetry. It's called Song of Songs or Song of Solomon in some Bibles. You guys may have this. It's in the Old Testament. It's actually this whole book is an allegory about life and love, and there's actually some real steamy stuff in there as well. And actually, historically, Jewish children were not allowed to read this book until they got to be a certain age, just to give you an idea. For what our kids see these days, it's probably pretty mild. But anyways, there's this verse in this book, in Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 15. It says this: "Catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, our vineyards that are in bloom." So like I said, this whole book is really kind of an allegory. It's a poem about relationships. It's about this couple that is trying to build something. It's not only about love, it's about life, and it's about their goal, their desires, and their future and what they're planning for. And this line, it says, "Catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards." And there's this idea that they're kind of getting at is that there are these little things that can cause big damage. Now, I think that a lot of us know what to be afraid of. That there's some big things to be afraid of. A couple of years ago, I had the chance to go back to Kenya. I've been there a couple of times on a few different trips, and Ez and I got to go. And on the last day there, right in Nairobi, just literally on the other side of a freeway from the city, is the Nairobi Wild Animal Park. It's huge, and you can go in and kind of do a little mini safari. There's a lot of animals that live in there, and we were maybe 20 minutes into this drive when we saw this on the side of the road. That's a lion, just in case. And so we stop, and when you do safaris, there's different types of safari vehicles, but one of the most common that I've seen in Kenya is like this miniature Toyota van from like 1985. It's kind of short and it's got a sunroof, and so if you're brave, you can stand up in the sunroof and lean over and pet the lion. No, I'm just kidding. But I was like, okay, this is great. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to get some pictures. I'm going to film this thing. And this lion, you can see is staring off. It's actually just watching a herd of some sort of deer or antelope or something like that. It was just like staring them. I was like, man, this is crazy. And so you're in there and everybody's whispering and just trying to be inconspicuous, and our 1984 Toyota minivan. It's like a little bit silly, but we're watching this lion just right there. It was a trip. It was huge. You could hear it kind of breathing and purring. It was really crazy. And then I switched over and I started videoing, and this is the video that I got. This lion that just sat still for like 10 minutes. All of a sudden, as I started videoing, it did this. You hear how silent we were all being? I was terrified. This thing was sitting perfectly still, and all of a sudden, it just gets up and starts walking. I was like, oh my gosh, you could hear I didn't say anything, but I was terrified. And you can almost even see this lion kind of glances up at me just to let me know, yeah, I see ya. It's like, real cool. It was a total trip. Now, we are on this, and we saw zebras, we saw giraffes and elephants, all these different types of things. And there's certain animals that you're like, man, we've got to be cautious. We have to be careful. This lion is dangerous. You see elephants, and it's like, man, even inside the car, this could be incredibly dangerous. There's certain animals, there's certain things that we know, like, I have to be careful with this. I've got to steer clear. I have to handle this the right way. And even if you take it outside of the animal world, you could take it to storms, hurricanes, different types of natural disasters. There's certain things that's like, man, we have a plan. We have prepared for this. We know that this is a serious thing if this were to happen. Well, in Song of Songs, it says, "Catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that destroy the vineyard." And so I was like, you know what? Let's look at, in comparison to lions and animals that we would normally be scared of and have a plan for. Have you guys seen a fox lately besides the video that we showed a minute ago? Let's look at some really cute, adorable foxes here. That's adorable, right? Just want to cuddle up with that. Here's one just getting a little stretch in. We've got a happy fox that you can look at. And then I know you're probably thinking, well, of course they're cute when they're adults, but, fox babies are probably really ugly, Well, let's just check this out. I mean, come on. I'm not a dog person, but I might be a fox person. there's this weird thing that's happening where they're saying, catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyard, that destroy the vineyards that are in bloom. This idea of what we are working towards, what we desire, what we want, the things, the goals that we have. There are these little foxes that can ruin all of it. Little, adorable foxes. These little things that we may not pay attention to because it's not a lion. It's not an elephant. It's not a hurricane. It's not an earthquake. It's not this thing that we have planned for. But these foxes can do a ton of damage. They're small things that can somehow still sabotage who we are and who we want to become. They can cause these massive, massive challenges. Now, there's other places where it talks about this idea of the things we need to pay attention to. In the New Testament, there's a book or a letter called Hebrews, and it says this in Hebrews chapter 12. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Now, this verse is a fairly familiar verse, and it's interesting to me because, again, it kind of breaks it into these two categories. It says, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles us. It's almost as if it's saying, look, there's things that are wrong that we need to stop doing. There's things that are sinful. There's things that cause clearly issues. And then there's also just things that slow us down. There's things that hinder us. There's things that keep us from becoming who we want to become, of achieving what we want to achieve, of becoming how God intends for us to be, whole and healed and transformed. There's things that can get in the way of that may not technically be wrong or sinful, but they can sabotage who we are becoming. And so we've got to pay attention to this, whether it's a big thing that we have a plan for, and maybe even more importantly, we cannot deny the big impact of small things that have the ability to sabotage us. So we're doing this series. We are going to be talking about little foxes over the next few weeks. And today we are going to be looking at the story of a man named Moses, maybe one of the most recognizable names in the Bible. If you guys don't know, I have a picture of Moses taken a few thousand years ago. That's who we're talking about there. Seems very easygoing, a real chill dude. Moses, we read about Moses in the Old Testament, and Moses, you may be familiar with Moses. He was born in a Jewish home. Israel was enslaved at the time in Egypt, and his mother, fearing for his life, she put him in a basket and she floated him down the river, and he ultimately was found by someone in Pharaoh's household. And so this Jewish Hebrew man who would have grown up, or baby who would have grown up to be a slave, ends up actually now growing up in Pharaoh's household. I mean, you could not have a more incredible shift of opportunities. It's a crazy story. And the interesting thing is that Moses, and what we're going to look at, he lived for about 120 years. Moses ended up with this habit that popped up a number of times throughout his 120 years. This issue, this challenge for him that kept showing up. It's really interesting because we think of Moses as, it's Moses. It's, Moses. But he had this thing that caused significant issues for him. It's this little thing that kept popping up over and over again. And he was able to do amazing things, but ultimately it was a small thing that caused huge issues in his life. And so this is what we're going to look at. And the very first part of this story, it's Exodus chapter 2. Moses is now an adult, but still living in the house of Pharaoh. And it says, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people, the Hebrew slaves, where they were, and he watched them hard at labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed him. He killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. It takes like a real hard right turn all of a sudden. He's out, he's watching all this stuff happen. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and he kind of looks to see if anybody's watching, and he kills the man. Now, you kind of get this idea. This may not have been intentional, he planned it out in advance. Obviously, he killed him in that moment, but he then tries to hide him in the sand. I think we've all seen enough true crime documentaries to know that's not a great place to hide a dead body, It's almost like there's this moment, and I kind of picture myself in this story if this was me kind of digging a hole in the sand and just thinking, how did I get here? Why did this happen? How did I let this happen? How did I find myself in this place? This was not the plan. I cannot believe for a second that this is really what Moses set out to do that day. I think it was really more of something that was an unchecked habit. I think it was an attitude, a temper that he repeatedly lost control of. And this is one of the things that I think is important for us to hold on to in this reality, is that character erodes slowly, kind of incrementally. Over time, it takes time for character to start to erode away, but consequences occur suddenly. There's these things that over time, slowly, we start to change. We start to kind of slip in different areas. Our character starts to kind of erode away, drift away. I was thinking about this, just even not character related, but with my kids. I've got a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old, and I'm with them a lot. And so they are growing children, but I don't always notice that they're growing. But my mom, who didn't see them for about 6 months while she was back in Tennessee, she came out and she's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how big they are. And we've all kind of had this experience, or you've seen this experience. It happens incrementally over time. And if you're there, you don't always notice what's happening. And then before you know it, from what people tell me, they will have graduated high school and moved out. No, I'm just kidding. But it's this weird thing where it's like all of a sudden it feels sudden, but it's happened over time. And the same thing happens in our lives. We make choices, we have habits, we have attitudes, we have little ways of living, these little foxes that somehow they erode away at our character over time. And we don't notice it until we are burying an Egyptian in the sand. Metaphorically, of course, for you and I. We don't all have a temper problem. This sermon isn't about anger specifically. I'm not saying that we're all going to struggle with this, but we have all kind of had this realization once or twice where it's like, man, I don't know where that came from. I can't believe I haven't noticed that before. Where we realize our attitudes and our actions, they lead us to something that's less than ideal. Somewhere we didn't plan on being. We ask ourselves, why am I struggling with this? How did I wind up in this situation? Where did I end up with all of this debt? I don't even understand why my marriage is falling apart. I don't know why I got let go of at work again. I don't know why I can't have a healthy relationship. We kind of find ourselves just in these moments of kind of a moment of clarity where we may not have all the answers, but we're just like, this is not what I planned. This is not what I imagined. This isn't what I want for my life, for myself, for my family. Sometimes we're just not aware of where these certain habits are leading. Other times we might recognize that we have these addictions or habits or attitudes, and we just think, you know what? It's just a little fox. That's just a cute little guy. It can't be that bad. I've got way more good things going than this one thing. Certainly it'll balance out. There's no way it's fine. I got bigger fish to fry. I'm not going to worry about this thing. But over time, we find ourselves, the things we're working towards and the things we want to become, they end up being destroyed like this vineyard in the poem. So the story goes on. We're going to skip ahead in Moses' life. Exodus chapter 32. Moses has led Israel out of slavery, out of Egypt. They've been wandering through the desert. And at this point, Moses is actually up on a mountain. He's been there for 40 days talking with God. I mean, it doesn't get more of a powerful spiritual kind of clarity experience than this. Exodus 32, verse 19, it says, when Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing and what had happened while he was up there, as all of Israel decided, you know what? Who knows where Moses ended up? Let's make an idol. And let's worship the idol. Let's do that. That seems like a good plan. So Moses is coming down. He sees the calf and the dancing, and it says his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf the people had made, this idol, and he burned it in the fire. Then he ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. Just a little bit of a temper tantrum. He comes down, he sees this thing, which, I mean, rightfully so, he is angry. They've not only just bailed on him, but they've bailed on this God that had led them out of slavery, who had led them through the Red Sea, all of these incredible miracles. And they had decided, hey, let's make a golden calf out of our jewelry and we can worship that instead now. There's a sense of like, well, yeah, I'd be upset too. But in this moment, his anger rises up and he throws these tablets down that God had written the 10 Commandments on, and he shatters them. And then he lashes out against these people. And there's kind of this sense where it's like, man, I would assume that Moses as a spiritual leader would be making really healthy, good, wise decisions. But it seems like he just really lashed out. Even though they were doing something wrong, there's like this anger piece that continues to show up in his life. He lashes out, does all of this on his own. You know, between his first outburst where we see that he kills this Egyptian man, and between this second outburst, he had talked with God in a burning bush. He had confronted Pharaoh. He had seen the 10 plagues play out. He saw God lead Israel out of slavery, part the Red Sea. At nighttime, there was a pillar of fire that guided them. He had seen all of these things. Even in this moment, he had just spent 40 days on a mountaintop talking with God. And it's almost as if, even though he was face to face and experiencing God, holy, powerful, creator God, he still had these struggles. And I can't help but feel like, man, I get a little bit of what that's like. I get that. I grew up in church. I kind of grew up around Christianity my whole life, and I understood the rules and what you should and shouldn't do. And now I'm pretty committed to church these days. And I get it. I'm around, and I worship, and I tithe, and I serve, and I try and build community and care for people. And I do all of these things that seem like God type of things. And still there's these things in my life that I feel like I'm still kind of broken. I feel like I should be past some of these things. Certainly by now, God could have fixed this part of me. There's these aspects in my life where it's like, man, how much do I have to do? Like, I love God. I've felt kind of emotional. I've committed my life. Maybe you've made that decision to say yes to Jesus. Maybe even this morning you were like, absolutely, my hands are raised and I'm worshiping and I feel the spiritual experience. And then as you leave this morning and a car cuts you off, you'll still find yourself shouting all kinds of things. And what is this gap? And it's interesting because for us, we have to recognize that saying yes to Jesus is the most important decision that we can make. And choosing to put our trust in Jesus is crucial. And it's the first step in this spiritual journey of being healed and made whole. In the New Testament, it's largely made up of letters that were written to new churches or new Christians, people that were trying to figure out, how do I follow the way of Jesus, and why am I still struggling with some of these other issues? And Paul, in a letter to the Colossians, he says this. He says, you've taken off your old self with its practices, and you've put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. And again, it's one of these verses that feels like, I don't know if they wrote that correctly. You've taken off your old self, your old way, your old life, and you've put on the new self, which is being made new. Like, I thought it was new. Didn't I just put on a new self? How can it be made new again? And it speaks to this reality that in the moment that we put our trust in Jesus, the moment we accept that grace, that forgiveness, that love that God offers us and invites us to embrace, we lay our old life aside and we step into this new life, this new reality. And every day after that, there continues to be this newness that happens, this transformation, this growth, or there should be this growth. There's a spiritual word that we don't use a lot here on Sundays. It's kind of a big word. It's this word sanctification, which you may have heard. It's this ongoing process of being made whole or holy or new. It is an ongoing process. We are immediately forgiven and loved and accepted, and every day we continue to be made new. There are certain things that only God can do in our hearts and in our minds and in our relationships. And then there are other things that God expects us to do. God expects us to move. God expects us to love. God expects us to extend grace. God expects us to move away from certain habits or actions or attitudes. We strip off this old nature and we put on our new selves, and that newness continues to happen day after day. And so there's some things that we realize, like, hey man, I got to stop robbing banks or whatever it is that you did before you accepted Jesus. Maybe it was that cool sounding. There's some big things, maybe the lions, like this is not okay, or the hurricanes, like I can't do this anymore. There's some big things that we kind of recognize, I got to stop. I can't do, this is not the right thing to do. And then I think there's a lot of little foxes that we don't pay attention to. I think there's a lot of small things that sabotage us. These small things that have the ability to destroy everything we're trying to work towards and that God is wanting to produce in our lives. Do you guys remember the TV show America's Funniest Home Videos? America, America. Now you're going to have that song stuck in your head. Bob Saget, the greatest family man in the world, right? No, I'm just kidding. So in this show, one of the things that they would do, we watched it every single night growing up. I feel like it was on every single night. And we watched it all the time. And there was this one moment, and it was before a commercial break, and they would show a video, and then they would pause it right before something terrible happened. And then he would say, what do you think happens next? And he would give like 3 or 4 options. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? And one of those options was always like a dad getting hit in a really unfortunate place. That's always what happened in every one of those videos. So you would kind of have to okay, this is what's happening. Let's imagine, let's assume, let's think about what do we think is going to happen as this plays out. I think that we can learn something from that. I think that idea, that concept, we can learn something from. I had a mentor who used to say this phrase all the time. He would say, play out the tape. He would talk about things, and it wasn't always in a warning. It was just an encouragement. It wasn't necessarily like, hey, you're doing really bad things, play out the tape. It was just in general, like when you go to make a decision, when you go to start a relationship, when you want to handle a business deal, or you want to talk with a neighbor, or you want to, whatever it is, play out the tape first. Where do you think this is going to lead you? How do you think this is going to end up? When we come back from the commercial break, what do you think is going to happen? Not in a sarcastic, judgy way, just in a genuine, play it out in your mind and think about, what do you think an unchecked anger problem is going to do for you? How do you think that's going to show up? What do you think that living a life that's marked by judgment on others, how do you see that working out for you? A life where you hold on to bitterness and resentment. Like, I understand you may have been hurt, but play out that tape. Who do you think you're going to become after 30 years of bitterness and resentment? A life of being unwilling to accept responsibility for our own choices. Play that tape out. Maybe we start to move into the relationships that we have with other people, the way we manipulate or use people, the way that we use or abuse alcohol, the sexual relationships that we have that somehow we've said, you know what, I'm okay with this, they're okay with this is not a big deal, this is just a little fox, it's whatever it is. But as we play out these tapes, is this leading us to the right place? There's a phrase that you may have heard of, or maybe not. It's a phrase called emotional cheating. This is how almost every affair begins in marriages. It's not necessarily that it starts with physical, but it starts with this emotional connection. This sense of like, we're just going to go to lunch. There's nothing wrong with going to lunch. I'm showing the love of Christ by taking a friend to lunch. How is that wrong? But it progresses, and you play out this tape of what does that look like as it goes on in the future, and all of a sudden this person that's not your spouse, you're more excited to see them on a Monday morning than your family during the weekend. And the first person you think of when you want to tell something exciting or good or whatever it is there's this connection that happens, and over time it leads to brokenness and pain in your own marriage and in other relationships. And what does it look like to play out the tape? Maybe it's something that you feel like you deserve, or a way that you let off steam, or an escape that you have. We have to play the tape out, these things that we feel like are just little foxes. It's not that big of a deal. I've got plans for the big stuff. But these little foxes, they sabotage us and they cause issues in our lives. Even some things that we may not think are actually wrong, I have to ask, do you think it's helping you? In 1 Corinthians 10, it says this. Paul again is writing. He says, you say I'm allowed to do anything, but not everything is good for you. You say I'm allowed to do anything, but not everything is beneficial. It's like yesterday morning at 8 a.m. when I decided that I wanted pastries for breakfast. And I drove down to the bakery and I bought a dozen pastries for a few of us. It's like, I was able to. I was allowed to. They were delicious. It was not beneficial. This idea of like, man, just because I can, or just because it's not wrong, or it's not sinful, does that mean that it's beneficial? Does that mean that you should? Does that mean that it's good for you? And these are the types of things where it's like, man, we don't pay attention, but they have an impact on us over time. These little foxes, when we don't pay attention, they sabotage who we want to be and who we are becoming, what God intends for us. And so we have to think about our habits, our attitudes. It doesn't have to be wrong or sinful or even evil to be holding you back or weighing you down. When you look at Moses' story, he was always angry for good reasons. The first time he saw an Egyptian person beating a Hebrew slave. It's like, there's a lot to be angry about in that. It's like, there's plenty to be upset about. It's a good reason to be angry. The response left a little bit to be desired. If you think about when he comes down from the mountain and Israel is built an idol and they're dancing and worshiping it and they have totally just bailed on everything that they have seen God do, there's a good reason to be angry with them. How could you do this? How could you give up on the living God that you saw who led you literally into freedom? There's a good reason to be upset. But the way he responded, is that the right way to respond? And later on, there's complaining and bad attitudes and all kinds of things. There's always good reasons to be upset, but right motives don't excuse wrong behaviors. Having a good thing or a good reason to be upset about something or whatever it is, it doesn't always excuse wrong behaviors. And so we have to pay attention. I know in my own life, there was for years and years, and really still today, I have like this really heavy bent where I get really upset about injustice. Not like Moses bury an Egyptian in the sand upset, but it really makes me angry when I see people being taken advantage of or pushed around. I get really, really upset about it. And it's a good thing. It's like, you know what? God fights on behalf of those who are oppressed. God is not for injustice. It's like, great. I'm super godly, right? It's like, sure, but how do I respond? How do I show up? And there was a time years ago where I worked for a guy and he was really, really difficult to work with, and he kind of pushed people around and took advantage of people, and he started doing this more and more with some people that I managed, and so I got really, really upset. I was like, I got to go talk to him, and because he's in the wrong, and he was. And I went in, and I exploded. Like, I was so angry, and I was shouting, and it was not good at all. I fought for injustice or against injustice in a terrible way, and I walked out of that office realizing like I had lost a lot in that moment. Not only did I not actually make my point, but I had really caused damage to myself, to my family, to my job. And I realized in that moment, man, I have got to figure out a way to manage this type of anger and resentment. I've got to figure out a way to fight for justice that's healthy. And I've spent years since then working towards that. Just because it's a good cause or there's a valid reason, it does not excuse wrong behaviors. A third story I want to look at quickly in Moses' life is in Numbers chapter 10. This is, they're still in the wilderness, they're still hungry, they're still thirsty, but they're free. But Israel continues to complain and groan and gripe about everything, and Moses is so tired and frustrated, and he asks God to help provide water because they don't have any water to drink. And in verse 7 it says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water.'" Verse 10, it says, "He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, 'Listen, you rebels.'" It's like almost exactly what God told him to do. "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" And then Moses raised his arm and he struck the rock twice with his staff, and water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Now, seems like everything ended up turning out okay. They got the water. But God said, "I want you to speak to that rock and water will come out." And Moses instead yells at the Israelites and then hits the rock twice. It feels small and insignificant in some ways, but it's just this little fox that keeps showing up in his life that somehow continues to erode away, and he just has this either neglect or just an inability to recognize it, and it continues to show up. And ultimately what happens because of this and a string of other issues is that this little fox, this little anger issue, this little habit that Moses has, it ends up keeping him from being able to see the promised land. This little thing that wasn't necessarily that big of a deal in some of these instances, that there was a good reason for it in other instances. Ultimately, it has this massive impact on Moses' life. And I fear that we have these things, these little foxes, habits and attitudes and actions and these types of things that we also don't pay attention to. And maybe it'll be a year or 20 years or 50 or 80 years in your life before you see the way it fully erodes away. But we've got to pay attention to these little foxes before they sabotage us. We tend to think of a habit as something that we do intentionally. But the reality is that a habit is just something that we do regularly. It's something that we just continue to do. We don't even necessarily notice it. Now, we have to be intentional if we want to start a new habit or maybe if we want to stop an old habit. But a habit is just something that we do regularly. And so when it comes to the things that we do regularly, the ways we respond and react and show up in our lives, we have to ask 3 questions. What is all of this adding up to? Where is it going? And who is it making me into? What is all of this adding up to? All of these little things that seem inconsequential and maybe aren't deal breakers individually, what does it add up to? Where is it going? AKA, play out the tape. What does this look like in a year, 10 years, 30 years? And then who is it making me into? There's been a lot of studies done about habits. There's a number of books, The Power of Habit and all kinds of Atomic Habits, a lot of great books. And they all essentially say that the best way to create new habits and to change old habits is not to just try and stop something, but actually to replace bad habits. And also, we have to choose an action based on who we want to become, not just what we want to do. So for me, I've been trying to go back to the gym over the last few weeks. Saturday was a cheat day with the pastries, don't worry. It's not that I decided I want to lose a certain amount of weight. It's that I said I don't want to be tired all the time. I want to have energy. I want to have energy at 5:30 when I'm hanging out with my kids for the first time in the day. This is who I want to be as a dad. And that's what's now driving me. Because I can come up with plenty of excuses to not go to the gym. But there's a sense of, man, who do I want to become? We have to ask these questions. What's it all adding up to? Where is it going? And who is it making me into? I think that we have to be cautious because some of these things are just neutral. Some of these things are really detrimental. They can sabotage us, these little foxes. A lot of times we don't address something until it starts creating really specific and clear problems. We like to just wait for things to become kind of a red alert type of issue before we address it. But what if we, today or maybe over the next few weeks, what if we decided and said, hey, I want to start now. I want to pay attention. I want to catch the little foxes before they do the damage. I want to pay attention to the habits, the attitudes, the actions. Yeah, I love Jesus. I've committed my life to Jesus. I mostly do the right things. I'm working really hard towards becoming this type of person. But there's always going to be a section of things in our lives that it's like, yeah, it's okay. I'll fix that next month or next year. I'll work on that in the future. It's not that big of a deal. What if instead of just leaving it unchecked like Moses did and seeing the impact that it had on his life, what if we decided I'm not only going to pay attention to these little foxes, but I'm going to play out the tape. I'm going to see how this is shaping up. And instead of just letting these foxes roam free, what would it look like for us to catch them? And to say, before you can do any damage or any more damage, I see you, and I'm going to chase you. You seem innocent enough. You seem cute enough. But I'm going to chase after you until I catch you, because I do not want to see the damage that you can do if I leave you unchecked. Let's pray together.